Hello, my name is Ildiko,
And I'm Phil.
and this is the My Open Source Experience podcast.
Open source is an incredibly social art.
Open source is innovation.
Like open source is enabling.
Open source is community.
And open source is weird.
Open source is incredibly important.
Open source is hard.
Open source is engaging.
Open source is collaboration.
Open source is like running the show.
Open source is ubiquitous.
Open source is, well, my life.
And open source is not free.
Before we dive in, let me give you some important reminders. People on the podcast participate as individuals. They do not represent any company or organization. All the thoughts and opinions are theirs. People share their stories and experiences, the way how they went through them and how they remember them, and reflect how those experiences affected their lives, influenced their decisions and their careers back then or ever since.
Welcome to the My Open Source Experience podcast. On this week's episode, Phil and I are talking to Nithya Ruff, and we are touching on a very important topic, which is open source inside companies. We are talking about key questions and common challenges, such as how to build your open source strategy, whether you're using or contributing to open source projects, and how to harmonize that open source strategy with your business strategy and why that is super important. How to hire talent and how to educate your employees about open source, the methods, the processes, and best practices, and many more topics. Enjoy the show.
Nithya, can you please tell us about yourself, a little bit about your tech background and what do you do?
Hey, Ildiko and Phil, so good to be with both of you. Just a little bit about myself. I run the open source program office for Amazon, and an open source program office is a pretty common structure today in large companies. So because we all consume so much open source, it's a way to help manage all of the activities associated with using open source. My tech background, I didn't get started in tech when I went to undergrad in India. I actually was doing a business degree, and then it was really thanks to my father who said, computer science is the future. You should go get a computer science degree. And so off I went. I flew from Bangalore, India to Fargo, North Dakota, and enrolled in a master's program in computer science, and did my computer science. So it was a very traditional computer science background. Started as a developer, but very soon realized that just development was not kind of satisfying me. I needed to go into product management, product marketing, strategy, etc. And here I am, many years later, having played kind of a role in lots of different parts of tech.
So would you say that your father was right?
Dad was 100% right. I don't know how and this was back in the 80s that he said, that's the future. You need to do that. And then coming into a background, coming into computer science, without any background was quite tough. But the journey has been really fantastic. And I also want to make a point that tech is not just development. The tech is all of us. We need financial folks in tech. We need marketing. We need communications. We need public relations, legal. We all together create tech. It cannot be just about development of something.
And do you feel that starting out in business and then going into computer science that helped you throughout your career, that you kind of got both sides early on?
Yes. I have to admit that knowing why we are doing what we are doing and how that serves a problem that a customer has or a market has, and how to get it to market, all of those actions really help inform the tech. if you're doing it without the context of the market or the customer or the problem we are solving or how we reach that customer, I think we're missing the boat. And even an open source project, right? You need to understand who is the user of this project, who are the ones who will contribute, how do I build community, how do I reach them? So all of these things has been very helpful.
Yeah, building a community in particular is almost nothing about the tech, right? I mean, writing the code is the tech, but building the community is all the marketing and understanding what your, as you say, what your users and what the other developers in that community need.
Exactly right, Phil. And people are messy. Tech is not. Tech is not messy. So you really need to have IQ, human IQ, or emotional IQ to do a really good job in tech.
That I can 100% relate to. Sometimes I feel like that I don't miss the business degree, I miss the psychology degree to be able to do my job in community management, because yes, human dynamics, especially in a global multicultural community, that's tough.
Yeah, it's very complex, especially all of the different stakeholders in open source, right? Foundations, maintainers, users, companies, now policy and regulators, and just so many different important stakeholders.
I'm still curious if you remember when you first learned about open source, heard about it, or like how did you get in touch with it?
Unlike a lot of developers who come into it because they started a project or they started contributing to a project, for me, it was through the business angle that I discovered open source. Not surprising, right? It was 1998. I was a product manager at Silicon Graphics in Shoreline, Mountain View, California. And we were in the business of shipping, very proprietary servers, right? IREX running on very beefy MIPS servers. And the writing was definitely on the wall for SGI, Sun, IBM, HP, that commodity servers running Linux was going to be the future, and that customers wanted cheaper, faster, better, but really we're building these big data centers and filling them with servers. So SGI started shipping a Linux-based server, and we had to very quickly start understanding what does it mean to run Linux on our server. How do we work with the open source community? And in those days, Linux was far behind Unix in terms of feature function. And so it was, how do we make up these deficits? How do we contribute? What pieces do we contribute? How do we support enterprise customers on an open source product? And how do we build those relationships with upstream so that we can provide the kind of SLAs that customers were used to, et cetera. So I was part of that strategy team at SGI, and I just absolutely loved it because it was the intersection of so many things, right? That's why we are all in open source. It's community, it's strategy, it's technology, it's people. It's how do you kind of make this thing work? And there were very few of us doing open source in those days, so I had a chance to be a pioneer on, building business models and support programs and, product strategy and things like that. So that was when I first discovered open.
So in '99, that was certainly, that was leading the market, right? I mean, that was quite early. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like? So management made the choice to support Linux, which was huge, I'm sure, in its own right. What did that look like? What were the interesting challenges and opportunities you ended up having as you were building that model for Linux and that whole product structure, right, for Linux in that company at that time?
Some of the challenges, Bill, were we could get away with really big prizes for IRIX on MIPS. And I mean, SGI servers were very expensive, and they were used in very high-end post-production and high-performance computing type of applications. So the question became, how do you make money on Linux servers on x86? The business model was one, and the second is, what are the markets for this server versus our IRIX servers? The bigger question was, how do we contribute and harden Linux such that it serves our customers better, right? Because there were so many gaps in Linux in those days, file systems and so many areas. And then
64-bit, NUMA, yeah, I mean, there were a ton. There were a whole bunch of things.
NUMA in particular.
Yeah.
And so we started contributing back to Linux in those days. The other big area was, our customers still expected us to be kind of the front end for customer support, and we needed to guarantee that we could fix it in a certain amount of time and provide the kind of support they required. But then on the back end, the upstream community was people that we had zero control over and zero kind of relationship at that time. So we were struggling to kind of understand, how do we bridge the gap between the community and what our enterprise customers needed. And then we were also trying to figure out something like, how do you market open source, as a company, right? Because you couldn't quite go completely community, but you couldn't completely go corporate. So a lot of us, like IBM, had a campaign of open source, where they had graffiti on the streets of San Francisco, talking about the freedom and, open source, right? So we were all kind of discovering, what does it mean to sell an open source based product? So we were kind of some of the first companies to crack the code, if you will, on commercial open source.
Was everyone in the company on board from the beginning of figuring this all out, getting the experience of what it's like to participate in the community if you were doing that, or did you need to navigate internal dynamics as well?
It is always a challenge to navigate internal dynamics in both companies that I've been in, SGI and then later Wind River Linux, Wind River. When you have an incumbent product that's proprietary and predominantly the company is proprietary, and you're introducing a brand new open source business line or product line, there's a lot of fear in the rest of the company on, are you going to cannibalize the rest of the company, and are you doing something outrageously different? How do you coexist with this strategy? And at Wind River also, we were competing. Wind River Linux was competing with VxWorks. And so you kind of had the same dynamics of, you can only play here, but you can't play here. And so I think we had to show that the world was moving this way, and we absolutely needed to have an open source and Linux strategy, and that we could not, we had to cannibalize our own products, and that we could not wait until somebody else came and, took over everything.
Yeah, I always draw the analogy of, SGI, I think, falls into the same camp as HP and IBM. I was at HP at the time, right? And we all saw that trend. And yes, it was going to be cannibalizing, our existing HP UX business for Hewlett Packard. But the alternative approach was what Sun did. And we see how that ended up in the marketplace. And Sun ultimately became a very small unit that continues to shrink inside of Oracle, whereas IBM and HP and SGI are still around.
Throughout your journey, you've been working with a lot of large companies on strategy and just helping with their open source transformation. What would you say have been the biggest challenge to accomplish?
each company was different in its own way. When you're creating products based on open source, like SGI and Wind River, it's selling open source based products. And then you have companies like SanDisk, where you had to acknowledge that for your hardware products to succeed, your open source ecosystem needed to be ready to support, what you were doing. And in the case of Comcast, it was a completely different strategy in terms of how do we show that we are a tech company and that we can advance media and entertainment through technology and not rely on just off-the-shelf, commercial products. So I think starting with understanding the role that open source and technology plays in your business is such an important part of the story. And often as open source people, you can come in and forget that there is a business and that is the reason for existence. And you can come in and with your evangelism about open source and say, hey, we've got to do open source because it's the right thing to do. And so you've really got to understand the context in which open source belongs in your company, how it serves the business and your customers, and then work, within that context, right? That's a big learning. And then the second learning really is that most businesses tend to view open source as risk in the beginning. And then you really need to widen their outlook to say it's not just risk, there are also opportunities in open source. And by embracing it, by knowing how to work with it, by releasing some of our own projects, we can actually create a wider opportunity for the company and the world. And then you need to learn how to work with your IP legal team and make them your friends and keep revisiting policy as the risk profile keeps changing, and to make sure that we are making it really easy for our developers and our business to work with open source. Sometimes if you just have a rigid policy set in 1998 and never revisit it, you miss out on a lot of opportunities. So I would say those are three top ones. And then I'll add a fourth one, which is you can't just consume, you've got to work with upstream communities that you're dependent upon. You've got to give, not just take. You've got to work with foundations. You can't stop at compliance. You've got to go beyond compliance and actually engage and be a part of the communities that you're involved in. I mean, with proprietary software, we often have relationships with vendors who supply those products, right? And yet, sometimes with open source, we just consume and never look back. And we have to establish relationships with especially big dependencies and be a part of the solution and not just be a passive consumer.
It's a great topic, and I'm gonna ask you to dig in a little bit farther there, right? Because it's very easy, and I think pretty much any company that's got any aspect of software development within their walls are leveraging open source and they're using open source. But it's a chasm to cross, right? When you go from using and just managing the risk of using to actually contributing, and to why, right? And as you've mentioned, the developers will say, well, because it's the right thing to do. And I've really found that generally falls on pretty deaf ears when it comes to management. But there are many other reasons that are very business centric, as you've kind of alluded to, in doing that engagement. And it is the foundations, it's the events, it's showing up and showing what you're doing. Talk a little bit about maybe any stories there with getting Comcast or Amazon or whomever over that hurdle, over that chasm, and how you bridged that, and the stories and what you did to get there with those companies for any given project.
Very, very good point. It's all in the details of how you execute, right? It's in the case of Comcast, when I came into the company, we had a great policy, or we had a great legal team, and people were able to consume open source without too much friction. But there was still a lot of friction around contributions. There was, you had to go up and speak to your IP lawyer, you had to get permission from your boss, you had to prove that this was not something that you could patent, and there was many, many hurdles. And in fact, the rumor in the company was you could not contribute, that it was frowned upon. So people had just given up or were contributing outside the system, right, on their own, without even telling their bosses, which is even more risky to the company. And so one of the first things we did was to streamline the whole process of contribution, make it very, very simple, very clear on what you needed to do to contribute. We divided it into, if it's very simple, if it's a bug fix, if it's a publication change, you don't even have to ask anybody. But if it is a small feature function, we'd love for you kind of just to tell us what it is, and we'll come back and approve it within a day. If it is a larger feature function, here's why we need you to come and talk to us, because we want to be thoughtful about how it is, and more importantly, the framing was we want you to be successful when you contributed, and not to miss a certain step or do something that could hurt your career in some way or hurt the perception of the community of you. So it was really framing about, we are here to guide you, not here to stop you. And that was huge. And even the way we called the approval body, it was called the advisory council, not the advisory committee. Or, so the language we used was to say, we are not blocking you, we want to help you. And then, we showed that a lot of the approvals were happening instantaneously or within a few days. We were tracking SLAs. And we publicized those who contributed and also how much we contributed. We celebrated that. All of that really made a huge difference to changing behavior. And sending a note to the manager saying, we want to acknowledge that this person has contributed this, and this has then helped us, move this product faster, or help the community kind of create a certain solution that they could not before. All of it helped the careers of the developers, but also send the message that we welcome contributions, and we will make the tactics easy to help with the contribution. I'd say that was a huge change in mindset in Comcast that we accomplished. And even just having the IP team with us, IP legal team, talking to them ahead of time and saying, here's the norms we see in open source, that this is not unusual. You should not block this because, this is something that is not a proprietary or so we would act as advocates for open source with the legal team on behalf of the developer.
How was middle management in getting through that? Product schedules, gee, it takes longer to get something put upstream. I got to get this thing out the door. Can you talk a little bit about helping them through the value of getting something upstream so that you're not maintaining it over time versus, again, hitting that product schedule, early on?
That is a big, big challenge, and it continues to be a challenge. I think middle managers have schedules to meet and deadlines to meet and goals to meet, and anything that takes away from that is hard. And open source, to be honest, has not really been easy sometimes to contribute to. You have to socialize your change. You have to wait for the right window for it to be merged in. Sometimes you may not make the right timing. And so, and the tooling that you use inside the company may be different than the tooling that the open source project uses. all of that adds a tremendous amount of friction. I must admit, we've had challenges, and one of the ways we've tried to inform the middle manager of why it's important for them to make time for this is showing the criticality of their dependency, and how by not making this change or by not allocating time to be involved with the community, that they could be hurting business continuity of their service or project or product that's based on that open source. And sometimes it is pointing out that if you don't get your change in, you will be left reacting to somebody else's change for the rest of the project. So you need to get your change in and make time for this, and that it'll pay off, in the long run. The terminology we are trying to use, especially at Amazon, is to say, this is business continuity, this is business strategic. And not everything is, right? I mean, if it is core to your service or core to your product, or it's widely used in the company, and that you need to stay on top of, then we advise that they allocate, certain headcount towards that community. If it's a small, inconsequential dependency, I would say, if you have time, do it. Otherwise, that's okay.
In talking with other companies, and I've seen this in my own experience as well, there's been a model of, you've got some level of developers that are spending the majority of their time in the open source ecosystem, right? Particularly on big dependency projects. And they're providing basically grease for the skids, for lack of a better term, of helping those product teams know how to articulate and how to position those changes that they need put in to an upstream project so that it's acceptable and most acceptable. And in some cases, right, creating that, because they have the personal relationships with those that are maintainers or code owners in particular areas, it makes it much easier. Have you seen that strategy? I mean, I know you've got some folks at Amazon that spend a majority of their time in the upstream. And can you talk about their role and what they do for the product teams across that are trying to get things in for supportability and as well as, again, feature enhancements?
Absolutely. I think in certain core communities, Postgres comes to mind. I'm trying to think of a few other communities, Kubernetes, and a couple of other communities that are really, really important to our services. We've often, been lucky enough to hire maintainers in those communities. And their role is to mentor, other contributors to successfully work with those communities, get their commits accepted. It's also to do the hard work of fetching wood and chopping wood and fetching water, and to make sure that the project is sustained and is continuing to do the testing and the documentation and other things. So yes, I agree with you that it's a great role, and we have to then educate the managers of those maintainers to understand the talent, understand how they work, the fact that they'll be working mostly externally, and to make sure to make time and reward and develop those maintainers. Sometimes it's a role that's so unique and different than the traditional developer role, that role can get undervalued or not properly protected from an investment and in headcount perspective. So that's where we proactively are trying to work with HR to see if role guidelines need to be changed, or how do we equip managers with documentation and education on how to manage your maintainer and frequent contributor to open source.
I find it to be the same for new talent acquisition as well, right? To have
Yeah.
HR be clueful that this is actually another asset, a strategic asset, that if somebody is engaged in a project, particularly one that we find interesting, it should rank them higher, right? As somebody that you would want to put into the company.
Exactly. I think the recruitment process is a hard one because if you put your maintainer through a traditional developer process, they would not make it. And so we've been trying to kind of identify the right bar raisers in open source inside Amazon who weigh in on new employees coming in, the right people for the interview loop, the right set of questions to ask, and then mapping the skill sets and the contributions of maintainers to role guideline, which traditional managers understand. And how to write a promotion document for a maintainer, right? How to write a performance appraisal, and what are the things to look for. So those are, they seem trivial, but they're so important to managing this critical talent of open source developers in the company.
I also wonder how it is viewed inside a company. In your experience, like when trying to advise internally in terms of how to do open source, do people only care for the layer of developers, engineers who write code, or is it more clear now that you also need to take all other roles into account? And when it comes to the company investing in open source and participating in a particular community that is a strong dependency, like, does the company factor in every single role, or is it still more a developer focused conversation and a product development focused conversation?
It depends. Some of the more sophisticated communities in our company have community managers, developer advocates, documentation experts, and they understand that they need a kind of a well-rounded team to make this project successful. Say like the open search team, they really have a well-rounded team. But then there are other teams where they think it's all about putting more development resources in, right? And but if you look at the OSPO and the open source strategy and marketing teams at Amazon and IP teams, we are all ex-developers or not developers at all. Some of us come from lots of different backgrounds, and I think there's understanding that we need all of these types of skill sets and roles to make our participation in open source successful.
Like we had said before, right? There are so many things about community that aren't developer, right? And so it's a big role for, if a company is going to play a role leading or substantially having influence within a community, you need those other characters besides just developers. It comes part and parcel with the activity.
Exactly right. And people like Phil and I play a role on the board from a governance perspective and from a direction of the entire ecosystem and community perspective. And we need people in all of these different roles bringing in their expertise and moving open source forward. Yeah.
How big a role does the community part play in, like when someone talks about those promotional documents or just a performance review? Like, because like when it comes to participating in a community that really has, the community part is really strong. So it's not just writing the code, throw it over the fence, and then yeah, I'm done. And anyone who has the experience of participating in open source does know that. But everybody else who did not get the chance I assume it might be hard to introduce this is how we also contributed to community building, for instance, and building the trust and being good community citizens. Um, is it hard to get that message across and put these processes together to have all those aspects built into them?
Some teams seem to do it naturally because they have such a large open source team, or they have a GM, a general manager, or a leader who understands it. We want to take that subjectivity out and make it consistent across the company. To your point, Ildiko, to make it clear that anyone who has an open source developer in their team knows how to correctly value becoming an Apache member, or becoming a PNC member, going from contribution to committer to becoming a maintainer, or to win an award in a community, or to sit on a governing board. So we want them to understand the significance of these accomplishments, and the fact that a lot of these developers are really influencing, building communication muscles, leadership muscles, collaboration muscles that a typical developer inside the company would not. When we look at the career trajectory from senior developer to principal engineer, distinguished engineer, etc., some of the muscles we're looking for are communications, collaborations, influence, scope of influence, all of complexity of problems that they handle. And we need to talk in those terms when we talk about open source accomplishment, so that it maps correctly to what we're looking for. Recently, we had one of our first senior principal engineer promotions for an open source person happen. And this is a pretty senior level, which gets a lot of scrutiny. And I was so proud that we were able to tell the story correctly in terms of company impact, but also connected to how this person was a leader in the community. It is hard, to be told.
Yeah, I think that's amazing because, I mean, in my experience, I worked with a lot of people in that management layer and just couldn't find a good way to get the message through, like all those community aspects, why you have to participate in maintaining the open source project. Isn't it just the free code that we are using? In your experience, how complicated was it for you to help companies that you worked with to transform that internal proprietary process into something that is taking open source into account? And do you think you reached a point anywhere where you could say that open source is a first-class citizen in the product development workflow and it's just fully integrated and works like a charm?
I don't think we're there yet. Reaching the developer is easier. And so I think we've done a good job of reaching the developer, but we are still trying to reach the manager of the developer, the product manager, the general manager of a service or a product that relies on open source. And we'll have to create specific messaging to each of those groups in terms of why they should care, or speak in their language. I think one of the best pieces of advice I got was, you can't come in and speak open source. You've got to come in and speak the company's language, business language. That's Amazon or SanDisk or Comcast. And so talking to the product manager about what she or he are trying to accomplish and how open source can play a role in that is important, and not just pure open source without context of what that person is trying to do. So I would say it's still a work in progress for the business side of the house, I think we've done a decent job on the developer side of the house.
I've also been wondering, I mean, I work for an open source foundation, so I view the world from a very different point of view. And I've been chewing on the thought, like how to help that management layer who doesn't have the hands-on experience participating in a community. You're very well equipped to at least start those conversations, but what's up with companies where you have people who don't have the open source experience, or maybe those who do, they are the developers who don't speak the business language? Are there resources out there that could help, especially the management layer who just, I think they're a little bit locked out, like how we talked about, even the communities, the non-code developer roles are just a little blurry. Like you can't just point the manager there and like say that, yeah, go there, get involved, get the experience, and then come back 2 months later and then we will talk. And if there are no resources out there, do you have anything in mind that we could create?
There are a couple of things I would say. One is if there is an OSPO in that company, to direct them to go talk to the OSPO and see how the OSPO can intervene and help talk to the managers about, the value of what they're doing or how to support them. It's a huge part of our job is to advocate for the open source developer, work with HR, work with managers, work with executives to make sure that this is a conducive environment. The second I would say is, I think when companies join user groups or attend an open source conference or become a part of a community like the to-do group, for example, or if they're in the user group for CNCF or for open infra, you meet other leaders from other companies and you kind of start normalizing that this is the way it is. And you go back a lot more educated, a lot more supportive of your teams. I remember bringing my VP from Comcast to the leadership summit for open source, the LF leadership summit. I think it was in Half Moon Bay or something like that. And he went back with a completely different view of what I did and how valuable it was that I came to these types of events and the networking I did or the people I knew. Then when he said, "Oh, she's going away to another boondoggle, in some fancy place, and I don't know what she does." So I think bring them with you to these events, let them hear you speak, let them see how you interact with communities is one, and then the OSPO I think is another one.
I don't know if you have the experience of sort of converting someone who's just, I lack of a better word, stubborn. In the sense that like in the management layer, if someone doesn't have open source experience, I assume you can't just tell them that, hey, go contribute for a month and then come back. If you can't do that, or should we? I mean, but if you can't do that, like what can be the ways to help someone understand what open source is without ever participating?
And I mean, if you look at the thousands of engineers in our companies, right? Only a very small fraction really would be maintainers or consistent contributors. Majority are consumers, passive consumers at best. And so most engineers never have to deal with it. And so they kind of say, why is this open source person getting these special privileges of being able to go to conferences or work from home or, all these other things? And you've got to be able to explain that in a rational way so it doesn't look like we're creating a special class of privileges for those folks. It really helps to have other PEs or senior engineers who say a manager or a general manager trusts, and to hear from them of what this means and why this is significant. is helpful. So the more trusted people you have in a company that can say, this is why we have to do this, and this is how we're doing it. It helps. It cannot be just the OSPO going out there and evangelizing. We need distinguished engineers and principal engineers and managers who get it, communicate to the rest of the company that this is the value of the work we do.
Do you find that it's been helpful with, I find that Log4j, as an example, really kind of shined a light for a lot of companies on the software supply chain, which is open source, as we've all discovered, and getting a handle on the management of that supply chain, because it really hasn't been a thought process. There are risks involved, and I think that's clearly been identified and acknowledged from a lot of companies. But it also means that having that context and having that contact with that supplier, the open source community, is also something that becomes critical to companies. Have you found that to be helpful in your argumentation to other managers as to why having people invested in this space is actually a strong benefit to your supply chain?
The short answer is absolutely yes. I think every time we've had one of these incidents happen, it acts as a forcing function to pay attention to the fact that we need to care for this, in a more thoughtful and proactive way. So whether it's all of these security incidents that have happened, or executive orders and regulations, or even missteps that companies may have had, there's a history of, you've got to go back and say, we had this misstep because we had not prepared this relationship correctly, or we had not assessed this relationship correctly. And so I think, was it Churchill who said, don't let a disaster go unused, or yes, something like that. I think a lot of these incidents have helped put more attention and educated more people inside the company on what we need to do, what's the correct thing to do. Otherwise, I think, open source just gets taken for granted. It's going to just run smoothly. When it happens, it happens. But incidents are the things that have really elevated the need for more open source work and investment in companies.
Before we depart, Nithya, can you tell us something about yourself that's not open source related and maybe not tech related?
So over the pandemic, a lot of us were not traveling. And typically an open source person travels a lot. And so here I had all this energy, and time on my hands. And so I started cooking. I opened my mother's cookbook, which she had written so lovingly to me when I was a college student and had not paid attention to. And so I spent a lot of time just mastering, the food that was familiar to me and was part of my past and part of my history, in southern India. And it opened up another world for me of the fact that this is meditative, this is relaxing, this is enjoyable. And it's taught me patience. It's taught me how to relax and not be all the time, wanting to do something or travel somewhere. So I would say that's for me has been a joy.
Now that travel is back a little bit, were you still able to keep up with cooking and just keeping this as a habit that stayed with you?
Yes, at the moment I come back from a trip, the first thing I do is to go look up a recipe I want to cook, because it just relaxes me. And it's something familiar that I want to eat or share with my family. And so I'm thinking creating a cookbook of some memories from my mother and from, the heritage that I had. So my daughters don't forget, a part of their food heritage, if you will, and that they continue to keep the recipes going.
If you ever decide to publish it, let me know. I will get a copy.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Make it open source, right? So people can modify.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I think starting an open source cookbook would be very fun.
Yes.
I love the idea. Everyone brings their cuisine from the culture where they grew up or just something that they got into. I think that would be very fun.
I think we should start one, Ildiko. We should, and especially reflecting the global nature of this community, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we should absolutely do that.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave your thoughts and feedback in the comments section of the platform where you're following the podcast. This season is full of very interesting topics. For instance, open source licenses, culture within communities as well as companies, mentorship programs, open source within companies, or in other words, why does HR have to know what free and open source software is? Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.
That was my first experience.
Oh, I loved it. Y'all had me telling stories that I haven't even thought about. And
Thank you so much for having me here. It was a pleasure.
Like, I will have coffee with the two of you any day for the rest of my life. Like,